I never thought I'd live to see the day when I'd be denied food in my own son's house, and on Christmas of all days. The smell of roasted turkey and baked cinnamon apples had filled the air, teasing my empty stomach as I sat quietly at the far end of the dining table. Laughter echoed around me, plates clinking, wine glasses toasting, and there I was, watching everyone eat, my plate deliberately empty. No one noticed. Or rather, one person made sure of that. Her name is Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. Beautiful, poised, and ambitious, the kind of woman who makes sure her lipstick never smudges even while stirring a pot. My son Daniel married her 5 years ago, and I wanted to love her. God knows I tried. I even told myself that her sharp tone and constant need to prove herself were just nerves, just her way of fitting into a family that had known love and humility all its life. But over time, the small cracks began to show. When I first visited their home after their wedding, Vanessa insisted I stay in the guest room. "It's more private for you, Mom," she said with that picture-perfect smile. I told myself she was being considerate. When she started calling me Mrs. Hale instead of Mom, I brushed it off as a silly habit. But there's something about tone, about the way someone looks at you, that tells you more than words ever could. And her eyes had always carried something sharp. Daniel, bless his soul, never saw it. He was too blinded by his new life, his beautiful wife, his growing business. He thought Vanessa was perfect. But a mother always sees through smiles. Christmas used to be sacred in our family. It was the one day when I would cook the meal, decorate the tree, and watch Daniel open gifts with that same boyish grin he had since childhood. But this year was different. Vanessa had taken full control of Christmas dinner. "You've done it for so many years, Mom," she said sweetly. "Let me take care of it this time. You just relax." I should have felt touched. Instead, I felt displaced. Still, I didn't argue. I showed up with a small batch of my famous pecan pie, the one Daniel always begged for, hoping it might warm things up. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with friends and coworkers. It wasn't a family Christmas anymore. It was a social event. Everyone was dressed to impress. The tree glimmered like something out of a magazine, and I suddenly felt small. Vanessa greeted me with a polite hug that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you brought pie," she said, glancing at the box as if it were an inconvenience. "That's sweet." Throughout the evening, I tried to stay cheerful. I smiled when people complimented the decorations, laughed when Daniel's friend told jokes, and waited patiently for dinner to be served. When the food was finally brought out, everyone was invited to the table. I followed quietly, feeling grateful to be part of it, even if in a small way. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Vanessa passed out plates one by one, calling everyone's name with that perfect hostess smile. When she reached me, she looked down at my hands and moved right past me. At first, I thought she simply forgot. I smiled, waiting, assuming she'd circle back. But she didn't. Minutes passed. Everyone began eating. My plate sat empty in front of me, and my heart sank deeper with every bite I heard around me. Daniel didn't notice, too busy laughing at something his colleague said. I wanted to say something, to call her out, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight. I stared down at the tablecloth, my hands trembling beneath it. When I finally glanced up, Vanessa was watching me from across the table, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. She'd done it on purpose. It wasn't about food. It was about power. And that night, as I sat in the corner of that glowing, laughter-filled room with an empty plate and a hollow chest, something inside me shifted. I didn't say a word. I didn't make a scene. But a quiet voice inside whispered something I hadn't felt in years. "She thinks I'm weak." And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Because she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wish I could say that Christmas night was the first time I felt Vanessa's coldness, but in truth, the signs had been there all along. I just didn't want to see them. It's strange how denial can wrap itself around your heart, whispering excuses that sound almost reasonable. She's young. She's just stressed. Maybe she doesn't know how to deal with in-laws. That's what I told myself again and again, as the months after their wedding unfolded like a polite but silent storm. At first, it was little things. When I'd call Daniel on Sunday mornings, she'd answer instead, cheerful but clipped. "Oh, he's busy right now, Mrs. Hale. I'll tell him you called." Sometimes he'd return the call hours later. Sometimes he didn't. When I'd stop by with soup or cookies, she'd meet me at the door with that perfect smile and say, "You shouldn't have, really. We're trying to cut back on sweets." Yet every time I came in, I'd see store-bought desserts sitting pretty on the counter. Vanessa had this way of making me feel like I was overstepping, like my love was an inconvenience. And the worst part? She did it so gracefully that even I began to question myself. Maybe I really do show up too often. Maybe I'm too involved. Maybe I need to give them space. But love makes you blind, especially when it's your child. I raised Daniel alone after his father passed. He was my world, the one constant in a life full of storms. Every decision I made was to protect his future. I worked long hours, skipped meals, and spent sleepless nights just to make sure he had everything he needed. And when Vanessa came into his life, I thought, finally, he'll have someone to love him as fiercely as I do. For a while, I convinced myself that's what she did. But the red flags kept multiplying, soft, subtle, and deliberate. One evening, I was invited to dinner at their house. Vanessa greeted me at the door, her expression bright, but her tone oddly rehearsed. "I'm so glad you could make it. Daniel told me you love pasta. I made something special." I smiled, touched. "You didn't have to go through the trouble, dear." When I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. There were takeout boxes hidden near the trash bin, and the sauce still bubbling on the stove smelled unmistakably like the same restaurant Daniel used to take me to years ago. She hadn't cooked. But as I looked at her, standing there in her apron, pretending, I swallowed my words. Why humiliate her? Why embarrass my son? So I smiled and said, "It smells wonderful." And she smiled back, that same perfect, polished smile, and said, "It's the least I can do." That night, Daniel went on and on about how lucky he was to have such a thoughtful wife. Vanessa just looked at me over her glass of wine, her eyes glinting. It wasn't pride in her husband's words, it was satisfaction. As if fooling him was part of the fun. After that, I started to notice more things. How she'd whisper to Daniel when I was around. How she'd change the subject if I entered the room. How she'd correct me gently, too gently, in front of others, always with a laugh, always framed as a joke. "Oh, Mrs. Hale, you're so old-fashioned." We don't really do that anymore. Every correction chipped away at my confidence. Every smile carried a hidden sting. The worst part was watching Daniel drift further away from me, unknowingly pulled by her strings. He stopped visiting as often. Calls became shorter. Even his tone changed polite, formal. My own son sounded like a stranger sometimes. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to blame him. Because I knew what charm could do, how manipulation can disguise itself as love. Still, doubt ate away at me. Am I imagining this? I'd ask myself at night, sitting in the quiet of my small apartment. Maybe I was just jealous. Maybe I was reading too much into her words. But deep down, beneath the denial, my instincts screamed the truth. Something was wrong. There was malice behind her smile, a quiet cruelty she hid from everyone but me. I just couldn't prove it. Not yet. That Christmas dinner, when she denied me food, was just the moment she stopped pretending. It was her declaration of victory, her way of saying, "You're no longer welcome here." And as I sat there that night, watching her glide around the table like the perfect hostess, I realized something else. She wanted me to break. To cry. To create a scene. But I didn't. Because for all her clever games and painted charm, Vanessa had made one fatal mistake. She thought I was weak because I stayed silent. But silence isn't weakness. It's patience. And that patience was about to become her biggest regret. The days after Christmas felt heavier than usual, like a winter fog that refused to lift. I couldn't shake the image of Vanessa's smug smile as I sat at that table, my plate empty, my heart burning. But what haunted me even more was Daniel's silence. He never asked why I hadn't eaten, never noticed my untouched plate. That realization hurt far deeper than Vanessa's cruelty. It was as if I had become invisible, not just to her, but to my own son. For weeks, I replayed that night in my mind, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, I told myself. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe I'd made her uncomfortable somehow. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's been buried under manipulation. It started with a phone call. I was at home one afternoon when I received a message from a woman named Karen, a neighbor of Daniel and Vanessa's. I'd met her briefly once at a barbecue. She sounded nervous, hesitant, but determined. "Mrs. Hale," she began softly, "I wasn't sure whether to call you, but I think you should know something." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "It's about Vanessa," she said. "And Daniel." I didn't mean to overhear anything, but I thought you deserved to know. Vanessa's been, well, she's been telling people she paused, almost as if afraid to continue. "She's been saying awful things about you, ma'am. That you're difficult, that you don't get along with her, and that you've been causing trouble. She even told people you refused to help her when Daniel was sick." I froze. "That's not true," I whispered. "I know," Karen said quickly. "Everyone around here thinks she's such a saint, but I've seen how she talks about you. She said she wanted Daniel to distance himself. That you're too controlling, too emotional." I felt the blood drain from my face. "She said that?" "Yes." And Karen hesitated again. "She also mentioned that she's been moving Daniel's business finances into her name. Said she's just trying to protect their future, but the way she said it, Mrs. Hale, it didn't sound right." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. Everything began to fall into place. The gradual distance, the subtle disrespect, the moments Daniel had brushed me off whenever I mentioned family matters. She hadn't just turned him against me emotionally. She was controlling everything: his reputation, his money, even the narrative of who I was. And she'd done it all with a smile. I sat there in silence, the ticking of the clock echoing through my small living room. Tears welled in my eyes, not just from pain, but from humiliation. I had welcomed her into my family, defended her when others doubted her, and loved her like my own daughter. And she had been tearing me down behind closed doors. That evening, I called Daniel. My voice was calm, but my heart raced. "Daniel," I said softly, "can we talk?" "Of course, Mom," he replied, distracted as usual. "Is everything okay?" "I just wanted to ask, has Vanessa said anything to you about me? About us?" He chuckled lightly, and the sound cut deeper than he knew. "Mom, please don't start again. Vanessa's been nothing but kind to you. She tries so hard to make things right." "Make things right?" My throat tightened. "Daniel," I said, my voice shaking now, "I know what she's been saying. I know what she's doing with your accounts." There was a long pause. Then a sigh. "You're listening to gossip again," he said sharply. "Vanessa told me you might overreact if you heard things from neighbors. I didn't want it to get to this, Mom, but maybe it's best if you give us some space for a while." Space. That single word broke something inside me. I'd given my son everything: my youth, my strength, my sleepless nights, and now I was being asked to step away from the very life I had built for him. I sat in silence, tears spilling freely as he ended the call. It was a long night. I didn't sleep. Every hour that passed, I replayed every conversation, every subtle manipulation, every moment I'd ignored my gut for the sake of peace. By sunrise, I wasn't crying anymore. The pain had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, sharper. Because now I saw the truth clearly: Vanessa wasn't just cruel. She was calculated. She hadn't denied me food out of petty spite. It was a message. She was letting me know that she'd taken everything: my place, my son, even my dignity, and there was nothing I could do about it. Or so she thought. I stood at the window, watching the morning light touch the frosted glass. My reflection stared back, older, yes, but not broken. The world had underestimated mothers like me before. But I'd learned something over the years: silence is power when you know how to use it. And from that day forward, I made a promise to myself: not to cry, not to plead, not to explain. Vanessa had taken my son's trust. Now I would take everything she valued most, piece by piece, quietly and without mercy. The calm before the storm had arrived. I spent the days after Daniel's call in a fog, the kind of heavy silence that clings to every corner of the house. Even the ticking clock on my kitchen wall sounded louder, as if mocking me with each passing second. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. Daniel had always been my reason to keep going, my light after my husband's death, my purpose through years of struggle. But now, that light had been dimmed by a woman's lies and my son's blind trust. I kept thinking about what Vanessa had said to others, the poison she'd spread behind my back, and that moment on Christmas, her looking at me as if I were less than nothing. The more I thought about it, the more something inside me began to shift. It started as quiet heartbreak. But heartbreak, when it lingers long enough, begins to harden into something else, strength. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the tired face that looked back. My eyes were swollen from nights of crying, my hair graying more than I remembered. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, a spark. I whispered to myself, "No one's coming to save you, Margaret." And that was the truth. No one was going to defend me. No one was going to expose Vanessa's deceit. Not my son. Not the neighbors. Not the family I had once believed would always stand by me. It had to be me. For years, I'd lived by the belief that kindness and patience could heal anything. I thought silence was noble, that restraint was the mark of a good woman. But Vanessa had mistaken my silence for weakness, and that realization hit me harder than any insult could. She thought she'd broken me. But she had only awakened the part of me that remembered how to survive. I started small. I went through old photo albums, pictures of Daniel growing up, birthdays, holidays, every moment that proved who I was in his life. I wanted to remind myself of the truth, that I was not some difficult woman Vanessa could erase with a few well-placed lies. Then I started visiting a few old friends I hadn't seen in years, people who had known me long before Vanessa ever entered the picture. The ones she couldn't manipulate. They listened. They believed me. And most importantly, they reminded me who I was. "You raised that boy into a man," my friend Carol said, gripping my hand tightly. "Don't let her make you forget that." Her words hit me hard. For so long, I'd let guilt and doubt cloud my judgment. I'd been so desperate to keep peace that I'd given up my voice. But peace without respect isn't peace at all. One evening, as I sat by my window with a cup of tea, I began to write. I didn't know what I was writing at first, it just poured out. Memories, events, conversations, every little red flag I had ignored. The Christmas dinner. The financial rumors. The lies. I wrote it all down, page after page, until my hand ached and my heart felt lighter. It wasn't just a diary. It was a plan. Because documenting the truth wasn't weakness, it was preparation. As I wrote, I began to see patterns, moments where Vanessa had subtly turned Daniel's opinion, isolated me, reshaped how people saw me. She wasn't just manipulative, she was strategic. And that meant, if I wanted to expose her, I had to be smarter. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. When I woke up, I felt calm. Focused. There was no more crying, no more pleading with the universe to make things right. Instead, I made myself a promise, one that felt like reclaiming my very soul. I would no longer play the part of the quiet, forgiving mother. Vanessa wanted war disguised as civility? She would get it. But on my terms and my time, and with the kind of precision that only a patient heart can deliver. I began learning about Daniel's business. I still had a few contacts from his earlier projects, people who respected me and remembered how much I'd supported him when he started out. Quietly, I began asking questions. Nothing invasive, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. Vanessa was moving company funds around, securing her own financial safety in case anything happened to their marriage. The discovery didn't shock me. It only confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't married Daniel for love. She had married him for control. That realization should have broken me. But instead, it gave me strength. Because now I wasn't fighting for pride. I was fighting for my son, for the truth. And as I sat there, staring out at the snowy streets, I realized something profound. You can't change people's hearts by begging. But you can reveal the truth so clearly that even lies start to look foolish. That would be my revenge. Not shouting, not bitterness, not cruelty. Justice. Silent, deliberate justice. I took a deep breath, feeling something I hadn't in months, purpose. Vanessa had taken my Christmas, my peace, and nearly my son. But she had also given me something unexpected. A reason to fight again. And this time, I wouldn't stop until she understood one painful truth: a mother's silence is never surrender. It's strategy. The weeks after I decided to stop pleading and start preparing felt like waking after a long anesthesia. Where there had been fog, there was now a sharpness, a clarity that made each small task feel purposeful. Revenge, I decided, would not be a tantrum. It would be quiet, methodical, and rooted in proof. First, I gathered the facts. If Vanessa had been able to spin tales about me and tuck them under Daniel's trust, then the only antidote was documentation. I pulled out the notebook where I'd been recording odd moments for months, the times she'd moved a photo from the mantel, the nights she'd sneak out with boxes, the odd comments to neighbors that later became gossip. Each entry read like breadcrumb evidence. I supplemented it with dates, times, and the names of anyone present. It was small at first, but it would grow. Next, I turned to people. I visited Karen, the neighbor who had first reached out, and asked if she'd be willing to tell me anything she'd heard, not as gossip, but as testimony. Karen's face crumpled when I explained, and she admitted she'd overheard Vanessa on the phone, explaining how it'll be easier once she's out of the picture. Mrs. Alvarez from down the lane volunteered to check her porch camera footage. She'd mentioned vans at odd hours before. The more I asked, the more small confirmations appeared like puzzle pieces clicking together. I also reopened channels I'd long neglected: old friends, church ladies, even a retired accountant who'd once helped me with taxes. They didn't want to be dragged into family matters, but when I framed my requests as protecting Daniel rather than punishing Vanessa, their faces softened. People will stand up for truth when you ask them to protect someone they love. Legal cover was important. I met with Mr. Benson, the solicitor who had handled Richard's estate years ago. I told him the bare facts, careful not to let my hurt skew the narrative. His brows furrowed as I described the rumors of transferred accounts and unsigned paperwork. If someone is moving money or property without authorization, he said, we can put a stop to it, but you'll need evidence that ties statements to actions. He agreed to keep an eye on any filings and offered to draft a polite yet firm request for information that could legally be served should anything suspicious surface. Meanwhile, I perfected the face Vanessa liked to see: harmless, smiling, grateful. When she flitted through the house, dripping polite compliments and managing host duties, I complimented her plush throw pillows and praised the menu. She preened. Each time she believed me more, she loosened up more. She'd grown careless. The small mistakes of someone convinced victory is certain. I set my social trap around that carelessness. Vanessa treasured her social circle: book clubs, mommy groups, neighborhood brunches. She loved applause and private praise, the sort of female validation that lubricated her plans. I used it. I organized a thank you brunch at my home under the pretense of celebrating the holidays and appreciating neighbors for their help. I invited people she couldn't resist: two of her closest friends, Karen, Mrs. Alvarez, and Daniel's colleague, Mark, who had always been fond of practical, direct truth. Everything had to be arranged so the reveal felt natural, not staged. I wanted the community to supply the atmosphere of disbelief and the law to supply the teeth. I asked Mrs. Alvarez to bring her camera footage casually, as if it were a harmless decoration of neighborhood life. I told Mr. Benson the date, asking him to be on call. I asked Karen to come prepared to speak if needed. Each ally nodded, their eyes steady with concern. At night, when Vanessa thought the house empty, I combed through old voicemails and letters I'd tucked away, piecing together a timeline. I took photos of suspicious email previews she'd left visible on the kitchen tablet and notes of the times movers had come late at night. I printed them neatly and slid them into folders labeled by date. There was no theatrics, just neat, incontrovertible chronology. Then came the smallest, most delicious part: bait. Vanessa loved to brag obliquely about her confidence. She'd say things within earshot like, "We've made all the arrangements," or "That will be handled soon." I let those words hang. I let her boast to her friends about commitments she thought were private. When she whispered about making everything secure, I allowed my expression to be one of worry rather than suspicion, prompting her to elaborate in front of others. People who carry secrets tend to speak of them in dangerous ways when they feel safe. She still believed I was broken, and that made her sloppy. That evening she invited her nearest circle for tea in my sitting room, showing off a plan she called long-term security. She smiled cruelly, assuming her audience would nod. Instead, I smiled back with the disarming kindness of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The final piece was timing. Proof alone can sit in folders forever. Spectacle alone can look like spite. I needed both, a public moment and a legal backstop. So I set the brunch for the weekend when Daniel would be home and arranged for Mr. Benson to be reachable. I wanted his calm voice to be the one that turned neighbor shock into actionable steps. On the morning of the brunch, I placed the folders where anyone could notice them, a polite pile on the dining table next to the coffee carafe. I wore my best smile and my second-best dress. Vanessa buzzed around, flattered by the attention the event brought her. She had no idea that the papers she might casually glance at could be the instruments of her undoing. As I poured coffee and greeted guests, my heart thudded with the steady rhythm of someone who had traded panic for preparation. I'd turned my hurt into evidence, my shame into strategy. Revenge, I'd learned, isn't about spectacle. It's about showing the world the truth precisely when everyone expects nothing. Vanessa moved through her guests, radiant and triumphant, completely convinced she had won. She hummed under her breath, arranging a gossip with a wink. If only she'd listened to the patient whisper that had lived inside me since Christmas. She thinks I'm weak. She didn't know how very wrong she was. The morning of the brunch felt impossibly ordinary, sunlight folding over the tablecloth, porcelain cups chiming, the faint scent of lemon from the centerpiece. I moved like a woman returned to herself, polite, composed, hands steady. Each small ritual was rehearsal for the moment I'd practiced in my head 100 times. Calm was my armor, truth would be my blade. Guests arrived, chattering about holiday plans and gift returns. Vanessa floated through the room in a new dress, luminous with the kind of confidence that comes from feeling untouchable. She greeted friends with practiced warmth, leaning into compliments like darts. Daniel arrived late, distracted, his smile automatic. He kissed my cheek and squeezed my hand as if to say sorry without saying anything at all. I poured coffee, made small talk, and let the world think I was the same quiet woman they'd always known. That illusion was important. Cruelty hides when it thinks everyone is on its side. The second they believed I was harmless, the cracks in Vanessa's house of lies would show. I set the leather folder on the dining table where the light hit it just so. It was a small, deliberate act, not a drum roll, but a marker. Here is the truth. Mrs. Alvarez, who'd brought the grainy porch footage, slid a USB into the laptop. Mr. Benson sat near the door, calm and composed, his legal presence like a steadying anchor. Karen sat with her hands folded, face pale with the nervous duty of a whistleblower. Mark, Daniel's colleague, settled in with the impatience of a man who hated charades. Vanessa noticed the folder and smiled, a tiny, self-satisfied curl. "Oh, what's that?" she asked, voice light. "Honey, did you invite a lawyer?" "How formal." Her laugh glittered across the room. "Just paperwork," I said, my voice even. "Old family papers I thought might interest you." I motioned toward Mr. Benson. He opened the folder and began, in that dry, factual way only lawyers possess, to lay out the timeline. He read the dates, the emails, the timestamps, the careful chronology that turned gossip into a case. He described the conversations the agent had admitted to, the evidence of attempted transfers, the late-night removals captured on video. As he spoke, the room grew quieter the way an audience falls silent at the first line of a play. Vanessa's smile thinned. Her hands went white around her teacup. Then Mrs. Alvarez played the footage. The grainy night images filled the screen, a tall woman slipping boxes into a car beneath the porch light, the timestamp sharp as a judge's gavel. A neighbor waved at nothing. Vanessa's face, reflected on the laptop glass, paled under the glow. People murmured. Vanessa's friends glanced at each other, confusion softening into dismay. The social applause she'd once basked in cratered into an awkward hush. Mark stood. His voice was blunt and quiet. "Did you tell Daniel about this?" he asked. Daniel's reaction was a slow unspooling. First disbelief, like a film exposed to light, then hurt, cracking his features, finally, the look of a man whose certainty had been quietly plucked away. He opened his mouth to defend her, instinct first, doubt a second later. "Vanessa, what is this?" he said, voice thin. Vanessa stumbled into explanations, clipped, defensive fragments flung like confetti. Her friends tried to salvage softness with excuses. Neighbors searched for ordinary reasons. But Mr. Benson's steady facts had teeth. He mentioned legal remedies, possible fraud, and an immediate injunction that could freeze any transfer. He spoke of reputations and the practicalities of taking a sale off the table. In the eyes of the room, the narrative shifted. This was no longer a family spat. This was a pattern with consequences. Vanessa's control unraveled with a slow, shameful elegance. The smiling mask she wore so well slid and revealed panic. Her voice rose, a brittle blend of anger and fear. She began to shout, the sound of someone who realized the audience was no longer hers. Daniel flinched. He reached for her hand, then hesitated as if recognizing the tremor of a stranger. Neighbors who had once whispered about their admiration now asked blunt questions. Where had the boxes come from? Whose name was on the account? Had she told the buyer the truth? Each question was a small exposure, each pause a public pruning of her credibility. The buyer's broker, called quietly by Mr. Benson earlier, had pulled back the tentative offer that morning, unwilling to step into legal uncertainty. Money dried up as reputations cooled. Throughout it all, I remained seated. I did not escalate or gloat. I sipped my coffee, feeling the aftermath of each word land like snow, cold, clean, inescapable. My hands did not tremble. My face did not show triumph. It showed only a woman who had been trampled and had finally let the world see the bruise. When the last guest left, Vanessa stood with her bag at the door, eyes wet and furious. She had been unmasked not with a scream, but with the patient, inexorable evidence of her own choices. Daniel did not follow her out. He stood, hollow-eyed and uncertain, the man between two truths. Vanessa's exit was not cinematic, no dramatic slamming of doors, just the small, final click of a lock. She walked away under the curious gazes of neighbors who had once envied her. The street that had once clapped for her now watched in silence. Afterward, the house felt fuller, oddly tender. I collected the scattered napkins and folded them neatly. I pressed the leather folder closed with 2 fingers, as if closing a book of wrongs. Outside, the magnolia tree trembled in a light breeze, petals drifting like punctuation marks. In the quiet that followed, Daniel found me in the kitchen. He put his hand on my arm with the awkward gentleness of a man trying to stitch something fragile. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was enough for now. A doorway opened. I didn't say, "I told you so." I simply smiled, the kind of smile that holds a lesson and lets it breathe. "We'll figure it out," I said. "We'll fix what's been broken." As I watched him go to make the calls Mr. Benson had suggested, I felt something else settle, a long, cooling satisfaction that was not vengeance, but justice, precise, inevitable, and calm. Vanessa had denied me food to make me small. I had fed myself with truth and patience, and now she left with nothing but her bags and her reputation. I closed the kitchen door softly behind me and looked at the magnolia in the yard. The petals fell like quiet applause. She had thought she'd starved me. Instead, she'd shown the neighborhood what hunger really looks like and what happens when you try to feed on someone else's life. The house felt different now, not louder, not emptier, but honest. The silence that lingered after Vanessa's departure wasn't heavy, it was healing. For the first time in years, I could walk through the living room without feeling like an unwanted visitor. My steps no longer echoed with tension. They carried peace. Christmas had passed, yet I found myself drawn to the kitchen that morning, to the space where everything had started, where I had once stood, hungry and humiliated, denied a plate at my own family's table. I remember the sting of that day vividly, the sound of laughter that wasn't mine, the clinking of glasses that seemed to celebrate my absence. Now, that same kitchen was filled with the scent of cinnamon and apple pie. Daniel had insisted on baking, his quiet way of mending. He was clumsy with the dough, spilling sugar and overmixing the batter, but when I saw him covered in flour, I realized something had changed. My son wasn't perfect, but he was awake. He saw me again. "Mom," he said softly, sliding a warm slice toward me, "thank you for not giving up on me." It wasn't about the food anymore, it was about acknowledgement. About being seen, heard, and respected. I smiled and took the fork, my hands steady. "We all learn," I said. "Some lessons just take longer than others." Vanessa had moved out of state soon after that humiliating brunch. Word spread quickly, as gossip always does in small towns. People whispered about the footage, the failed sale, the lawyer's calm dismantling of her lies. Her perfect reputation had fractured, not because I shouted, but because I told the truth and let it breathe. Justice, I've learned, doesn't need noise. Sometimes it arrives dressed in silence, steady, certain, and impossible to outrun. Months passed. I found myself rebuilding, not just my dignity, but my life. I joined a local women's community group, teaching cooking classes for single mothers and retirees who felt forgotten by the world. Every time I handed someone a plate of warm food, I thought about that Christmas, the one where I had been denied nourishment, not just of the body, but of the soul. And I realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest revenge is turning your pain into someone else's healing. Daniel started visiting more often. He called me Mom, again with warmth that had been missing for years. There were still quiet scars between us, but they no longer hurt. They simply reminded us where we'd been. He told me he was seeing a counselor, trying to untangle why he'd let someone isolate him from his own family. I didn't need to hear his apologies, his actions spoke louder. On the 1-year anniversary of that cruel Christmas, I hosted dinner at my house again. The table was long and full, with new faces, friends, neighbors, even Mrs. Alvarez and her husband. There was laughter, music, and the smell of roast chicken filling the air. As I poured gravy into Daniel's plate, he caught my eye and said quietly, "You are right, Mom. A house without love isn't a home." I nodded, emotions swelling in my chest. "And love," I replied, "isn't always quiet, but it never has to prove itself through cruelty." Later that night, after everyone left, I stood by the window, watching snow fall in soft, endless sheets. The magnolia tree outside was dusted white, the same one that had witnessed both my humiliation and my triumph. For a moment, I thought about Vanessa, not with anger, but with a strange compassion. She had tried to shrink me, to make me question my worth, and in doing so, she had revealed her own emptiness. I didn't destroy her life. She simply built it on lies, and truth was the wind that blew it down. I took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the fire behind me. My reflection in the window looked older, wiser, freer. The woman who had been silenced, starved, and dismissed was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, not bitter, but whole. They say revenge is best served cold, but I disagree. Real revenge is served warm, with peace, dignity, and the knowledge that you rose above those who tried to break you. So when I tell this story, it's not just about food, or pride, or punishment. It's about reclaiming your voice when someone tries to take it from you. It's about knowing your worth even when others forget it. And it's about remembering that silence, when filled with purpose, is louder than any scream. Before I end, let me ask you something. Dear listener, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Have you ever been made to feel small in a place where you should have been safe? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one, because stories like ours remind others that strength can be reborn from humiliation. And if this story moved you, if you felt that spark of courage deep inside, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another person needs to hear that it's never too late to stand tall again. She denied me a meal to make me feel powerless, but in the end, I fed the truth, and it devoured her lies.